Great. Hi, everyone. Today, Annie and I are recording our part of our series for the training core on Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And so this is a presentation I gave earlier in the semester live in person, but we forgot to record. So here is our recording of this. And, as I started out last time, I do not consider myself an expert in Indigenous data sovereignty, but I do consider myself or it's my personal belief, I guess also professional belief, that this is a very important topic, particularly for all of us that are working with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous data. And so whether you're actually collecting it or using it as secondary data, or just starting to potentially be interested in working on any of these issues, I think it's a very important foundation training to have. And so this is a requirement to be part of the Superfund training or the Superfund core. And I hope that you'll learn a lot out of it and instill some of these principles into your work. Great. Okay. And so, first of all, I'd like to start off, just introducing different people in the field that have been putting in the work for, over a decade. So these are Indigenous scientists that are leaders in this space. And so you probably have heard me fangirl a lot about them. First, we have Dr. Carlotta Chief. She is an Indigenous scientist, trained as an engineer, and works a lot on the environmental and energy space on Native lands. The other one is Dr. Lydia Jennings, who is a phenomenal scientist. She does a lot of work on mining and data science and environmental stewardship, and has really taken this and to the next level. And of course, we have Dr. Stephanie Russo Carroll, who was really the pioneer and bringing in Indigenous data sovereignty principles and the field to what it is now. And so she started this back when she was a grad student at University of Arizona, and has now really established herself as like the premier expert on this topic. And of course, we have my girl Desi, Dr. Desi. So she is a sociologist by training, and has done a lot of work on Indigenous data sovereignty, both within the like a United States context, but also globally. And so she not only got one PhD, she actually has two PhDs. Her second one being in demography from I believe in New Zealand. And so these are very much, recommend any of their readings, any of their podcasts. I think quite a few of them actually now have been on NPR talking about the subject. So very much recommend anything that they've ever put out or any of their presentations, which I think you probably would find also on YouTube. And so I want to take a moment to ask the question of, has anyone ever seen this? And obviously, on air, pauses are a little bit awkward. So I'll just, count to five in my head. And, for those of you that might not be familiar with this is actually what's called a winter count. And this one is specifically it's called the Lone Dog Winter Count. It is Sioux, and it tells, back in terms of recording history, Indigenous people used to use these, and they would pick someone who was like the knowledge holder to be able to record something that was like extremely important. So they would pick something for 1 year, and they would write it down on these skins as like the most important thing that happened that year. And so in here we can see that this one goes from about 1800 to 1871. And one of the things that, for any of those that are in public health, what do you think this reminds you of? And these little ones right here, specifically, for those in public health, you might look at that and be like, oh, that sort of maybe reminds me of like smallpox. And that is like denoting the year that there was like a smallpox outbreak within this indigenous community. And this has actually been verified or validated across other winter counts that people have found. And so even across different nations that even weren't like right next to each other, they see that in that specific year, there is quite a few that appears. And so I particularly love this quote by Desi that says our people have always been data gatherers. And so this really pushes against the belief that Indigenous people haven't really, been data stewards or data sharers or data knowledge holders, and really brings that back that they have been really at the forefront of what we consider data stewardship. And particularly for this one, this is one of the what we consider one of the earliest examples of census or census data or census timelines. And so that's what I particularly really like that of what it shows. And so, you might be asking yourselves, what is actually Indigenous data? And so Indigenous data refers to any information, data, or knowledge in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, their nations, their communities, both as individuals and as collectives. And for a lot of us, you sort of we're very much trained on for data, just thinking about it in terms of numbers. But for a lot of Indigenous communities, oral histories, their stories, that actually is also it counts as data. And so this also refers to data about their resources and environments. So for us that work mostly in environmental health, we know, right, like the land, the water, any of the images that may be working through satellite. It also refers to them as data as individuals. A lot of us, the survey data that are collected, any like Medicare information or health data that you're getting from them. And this even refers to like administrative records, school records, any of that type of information. And then we also have what we would consider data about them as collectives, nations, and people. And this really refers to, for example, any of information that you get from, learning about their traditions, their culture, their archives, the oral histories. And this really, in terms of Indigenous data, it is a different worldview. A lot of what we consider more in like traditional science, which is rooted in settler colonial systems, we tend to think of data as like quantitative, right? Just these numbers, that it's objective, that our biases don't actually influence any of the workflow. And these observations usually have to be made by, people that are trained or scientists or group of professionals. And a lot of the times, this knowledge is also mostly only held by the institution. But Indigenous science practices, or what we kind of have now come to know as traditional ecological knowledge, really pushes against these ideals. For them, Indigenous data, Indigenous science practices really take into account both the qualitative and quantitative methods. It really it really talks about a lot about positionality and subjective and taking into account our own lived experiences into the Indigenous data realm. And also this idea that knowledge is held by the collective and it does no good just being held by institutions. And I particularly love this quote by Maggie Walter, who again has also been at the forefront of Indigenous data sovereignty. And she says, experts spend far more time perfecting the technical flaws in their methods and cleaning the data than they do exploring the interpretive limits of the very categories from which they draw their conclusions. And so we take a moment to think about this, and of course, I've also been guilty of this, that we spend a lot of time teaching you all how to do, our workflow in R or Python or any of this in terms of like, accounting for mistiness or making sure every variable is in the right format, but without really taking into account, where the data came from, how they were collected, the context, like who really is behind, and what are they, what are we actually trying to interpret from the values that we gathered. Now that you have, a foundation of what Indigenous data is, Indigenous data sovereignty really refers to the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection and ownership and application of their own data. Um, it, you know, for many of you, this might come to a surprise, and you're like, oh well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, of course, they should be able to govern their own data, but this not wasn't always the case. And this right for them to govern their own data is derived from their inherent right to govern themselves, their peoples, and their resources. It also takes into account their traditions and roles and responsibilities, and to hold community information. And then Indigenous data sovereignty also positions this right for them within a human's right framework through court cases that have happened, treaties, and their recognitions as them themselves being sovereign and individual people. And so now I'll transition a little bit into talking about the erasure of Indigenous people in the context of data and data governance. And so one of the things, particularly in the next few slides that you'll see, is that, or why this issue of Indigenous data sovereignty is so important for us, is that throughout history, there really has been this systematic erasure of Indigenous people being able to govern themselves or even be able to speak about themselves with their own data. And so this really started back in, the beginning of colonial America. Um, and so in the first part of this, when the census first came about, it didn't actually count everybody. And one of the people that were specifically excluded from them were Native Americans. Um, Specifically because under then at the Constitution that was declared, it excluded them because they were not taxed. And so if they weren't taxed, they weren't going to be considered actual people that were going to be counted in the census. And so particularly here, it says that they were excluding Indians, not taxed, which they only considered to be 3/5 of all persons. So really from the beginning of, and for all of us that we know, like we actually use census data a lot in public health, right? We use it for any of you that ever use the American Community Survey or population data or just trying to compare demographics. This has had like long lasting repercussions of a decision that was made before any of us even were here. And so starting with that, again, not being considered in people enough to count in the original census really contributed to this idea that there weren't any Native Americans living in the United States, that there was land for the taking. And so that's sort of what was ended up happening with the expansion into the west side of the United States. It wasn't until 1924, so we're skipping over, a couple hundred years, that the Indian Citizen Act was introduced in 1924. And then with that, it actually made it, or not made it, but it sort of legalized citizenship for Native Americans. And so just sort of imagine that, like, you've obviously lived in this, your own country forever, and this has been your homeland since time immemorial. And then there's a government that comes in and says, like, oh, well, now we will consider you people of the Americas. So again, it's this like continued systematic erasure of them. And so after the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which I think just completed its 100th anniversary a couple of weeks ago, the beginning of June, again, the government was interested in actually counting the population, and so they specifically set out a census, the 1930 census, so that they could actually count Native American people throughout the United States. And so here we see the first like maps of that. So here one dot considering 50 people, and we get to see where most of them are populated, right? And then from that, the Indian Citizenship Act, we're going to skip over again a couple of more decades to the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And so the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is actually a really wonderful document that I recommend everybody take time to go through all of the declarations. But in there, it specifically calls or states that Indigenous people have a right to the full enjoyment of their lives. And in there, it really reaffirms their right as peoples to govern themselves and around the world to also access and control data about their people's territories, lifeways, and resources. And here we noted, which acts actually talk about their right to data. And, for those not familiar with the United Nations Declaration of Rights, it's not necessarily a legal document, but it is a great framework, particularly one that acknowledges that Indigenous people are everywhere around the globe, and it's not necessarily just Indigenous people to the Americas or Indigenous people to Australia. It's worldwide that acknowledges that these rights are inherited from them. One of the things that you may be surprised to learn is that actually a lot of the data of that has been produced on Indigenous people is actually held or been held or gathered by people that are not Indigenous. And so even the majority of the producers and users of this is mostly federal governments, right? When we think about them trying to count out how many people are, their land or resources, it's primarily been for federal government purposes. And then it wasn't until 2016, so again, a few hundred years between when Native Americans weren't considered people, and then switching over to 2016, where we get the first book that actually focuses on Indigenous data sovereignty. And the book has done a really great job at establishing, this foundation of what is Indigenous data, what does it mean for Indigenous people, and I particularly also love that they talk about it and that they hope that this inspires other people to actually be able to, particularly Indigenous people, to be able to assert their rights to control, own, and further develop their own knowledge and cultural heritage so that hopefully this also transmits to their younger generations. So as I've mentioned, a lot of the data that has been produced, right? And if we think about even just like how Superfund operates, we're sort of like in this in a little bit on this category too. And so a few years ago, there was a review about data sources and where they were actually coming from. And so of the 295 data sources that were identified as data that pertain to Indigenous people or their lands, less than 2% of them actually came from a tribal source. And here we see a couple of them. I highlight that we may, are sort of environmental health adjacent. The US Census, again, that's all like self-identification by the United States government. Same thing with the American Community Survey. And then Indian Health Service, again, of how it pertains. And then we do have information about farm sizes that come from like the USDA. And again, these just showing again that even in this day and age, a lot of the information is coming secondhand from people that are not actually Indigenous or have had the opportunity to gather that information. And so for a lot of us, particularly that we're collecting, human information, we sort of end up being in this space where we are working with Indigenous people and environmental data, but we also have to navigate the research protocol and processes through the Institutional Review Board. And so a few years ago, some of you may remember that they actually, the NIH actually revised this and now is known as the Revised Common Rule. And so with there, the NIH or actually it's not the NIH, it's the Human Health Services committee that governs the research part of this. But that committee actually came together and said that they finally recognized that the right that each tribe and tribal government has the right to govern their own process and to develop their own laws related to the protection of human subjects, and that those rules can be even more protective than current rules set for like in a United States context. And so this really was like the first time that this was acknowledged, even though again people had been pushing against tribal institutional review boards for a really long time. Now with this in place, researchers that particularly that are conducting research with Indigenous people, and a lot of this mostly refers to Indigenous people that are still living within their sovereign nations. The rules are a little bit more gray for Indigenous people that happen to live off of their reservations. But it is established that if you are going to be working with Indigenous people that are within their own nation, you have to seek approval from their institutional review board or whatever their process may be. And that ultimately establishes that that they have the right to oversee and decide who actually gets to be conducting research in their appropriate manner. And here we have a map from that established, which IRBs were active or deactivated and which were held within the reservation. So I'll say that again, no tribal IRB process is the same. Everybody functions differently. Some of them actually have a tribal IRB. Some of them you just have to go to tribal council. And so it very much varies from tribe to tribe. I'll also take a moment to say that uh, at least federal recognized tribes in the United States, there's about 563. So again, each of them have their own rules, their own regulations when it comes to human subjects protection. And so after this, the 2018 and the establishment that tribes would be able to control their own IRB and human subject protections, came the revised rule for sharing data. And so some of you might be a little bit familiar with that, right? Because like now we're entered into this stage where if you've been given federal funding, there's all these stipulations about how you have to actually make your data available. And so that does not apply to Indigenous communities. And even since like 2019, when this conversation first came about, they very much established that just because you consulted with the tribe does not mean that they have given you consent to do any type of research. And so this also played into NIH recognizing that there's been a lot of harm that has been done to Indigenous communities, and that they had failed to accurately protect and honor their own sovereignty, and that a lot of the research that had previously been done had caused a lot of stigmatization. And so they sort of, kind of hope to remedy this by establishing a tribal health research office and an NIH strategic plan that talk about how they're integrating Indigenous voices into the biomedical research realm. And we've sort of gone through quite a few decades now, or maybe centuries of research with Indigenous people, and up until this current presidential administration, there really hadn't been done anything at a federal government level to recognize like indigenous knowledge and its contribution to society. And so now there's been a series of federal announcements and federal amendments that have come out that have recognized Indigenous knowledge as one of the many important bodies that have contributed to the scientific, technical, social, and economic advancement of the United States. And so this really came into about with the White House, I guess now it's a couple of years ago, release this guidance for federal agencies on how they must integrate Indigenous knowledge into their decision-making process and their programs. Again, this is one of those things that has been like long overdue, since time immemorial. And this really, we'll see what comes of it in terms of its implementation, but it really talks about Indigenous knowledge as its own field and its own contribution, and sets the precedent that that this does need to be integrated into all of the whether it's like grant implementations, research, workflow of not just like in terms of a research arm, but a practice. And lastly, I'll end with how you or us together as a team can uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. One of them is recognizing and promoting it, right? So a lot of the times, even in the conferences or talks, it's not a topic that comes up unless you're specifically really going to a workshop or a conference that is dealing with Indigenous people or Indigenous data. Recognizing that there are multiple ways of knowing, and that just having data or our data sets is one way, and listening to the actual communities and engaging with them is part of this process. That we should be conducting science and service to community and community-driven research that builds capacity. So I know for us, we've been really working, with community organizations and the ground, particularly Missouri Breaks, to be in a lot of the Indigenous high school students that Annie and I both mentor to Earth. Is certainly part of our mission. But there's always more that each of us at the individual and as a department and group can do. It also means engaging and promoting an Indigenous scholarship. So I'll say this again, as I said it earlier, or back when you might have first seen this presentation live. Please cite the women, the scientists that I've talked to here about today. Cite them in your paper. We know how academia is like. right? Impact factor, citations, all of those things matter for promotion. And so if we really are committed to, not only advancing Indigenous health research and Indigenous data knowledge, but also the people that are behind producing a lot of this information. So please cite them. Like I want to see everybody be citing them in our conference presentations and our research and dissertations, publications, all of that. And then, of course, using and supporting Indigenous data governance protocol and procedures. And so this means not only necessarily like, okay, I'm making sure that you're following IRB rules, but that we are, communicating our information back with the community members, that we're being respectful of the findings and overall making sure that they align within the context and their worldviews. And then I know this is outdated because this conference obviously happened in April. But I do believe that they're hoping to have this conference in every 2 years. So hopefully not this year, but like in 2026, quite a few of us are able to attend. And so I'll just put in a plug for that. And of course, two of my other favorite readings, particularly Indigenous Statistics by Maggie Walter, who's again been a pioneer in this stage. And this Indigenous statistics one, it doesn't necessarily like you're not going to actually go through any regressions or Bayesian modeling or any of that. What it actually talks about is like the process and the methodology behind it, and not necessarily focus on methods, but like how you can integrate better like subjective methods into this. And then one of my favorite books that really helped me establish what it meant to study environmental health within an Indigenous worldview is Guided by the Mountains. And so this one really, it's a book. It came out a few years ago, but it really talks about the sacred elements and a lot of like the Net philosophy and how they viewed the environment. And again, that really helped me establish like um, what it meant to be an environmental health researcher, or at least study it in the context of an Indigenous world point of view. And I think we'll probably link the additional readings. You don't have to like, do any copy and pasting. But here, always welcome feedback. You can definitely keep adding to this bibliography of additional information for you to be able to have. And with that, I think we will end the recording. And if you have any, follow-up questions and all of that, we will be available and also have the quiz available that we want everybody to be able to take.
Thank you so much, Yoshi. Thank you for this great talk. And yes, if you are watching this recording as part of your onboarding for engagement and working with the Columbia University Northern Plains Superfund Research Program, this is part 1 of 3 of the training. So part 1 is to watch this video. Part 2 is to watch the lecture by Stephanie Tucrow on cultural preservation within our ecosystem. And step 3 is to read a article by Lydia Jennings and colleagues on incorporating care principles into our work with the Columbia University Superfund. So please complete those 3 parts, and then you can take the quiz on Qualtrics. It's a short quiz, a completion-based quiz, to indicate that you have completed those 3 components of the training. And please let Yoshi and I know if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks.